The moon hung low in the ink-black sky, casting pale light over the countryside. Crickets chirped in the distance, their song swallowed by the vast emptiness of the land. The house stood alone, an old but renovated structure, with a dark history buried beneath fresh paint and modern furniture. Inside, in the dead of night, something shifted. A child's giggle, soft and breathless, echoed down the hallway, though no one was awake to make the sound. The Warrens had moved to this secluded western countryside for a fresh start. Michael and Lauren Warren, a couple in their late 30s, were eager to escape the suffocating noise of the city. Their son Daniel, only 6 years old, had been struggling with night terrors in their old apartment, and they hoped the peaceful countryside air would bring him some rest. The house, with its wide wooden floors and antique charm, seemed perfect, a dream home with just enough history to feel timeless. But on their first night, something felt off. Lauren awoke with a start, her body cold despite the heavy blankets. The room was eerily silent, too silent. She turned toward Michael, still sound asleep, his breathing steady. But something was wrong. The air was thick, suffocating, and in the corner of the room, just beyond the glow of the moonlight, she thought she saw a shadow move. Shaking the thought away, she got up and walked to Daniel's room. The hallway seemed longer in the dark, stretching endlessly before her. The wooden floor creaked beneath her feet, and as she reached Daniel's room, she hesitated. The door was open just a crack, though she was certain she had closed it earlier. She pushed it open slowly. Daniel sat upright in his bed, his wide eyes locked on something in the corner of the room. His small chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. Lauren followed his gaze, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "did you have a bad dream?" Daniel didn't respond. His lips trembled. His tiny fingers clutched his blanket so tightly, his knuckles turned white. Then, barely above a whisper, he spoke. "The lady says we don't belong here." Lauren's breath caught in her throat. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the house, the sound of soft footsteps echoed through the hallway, light and careful, as if someone was trying not to wake the family. But everyone was in bed. A thin layer of fog clung to the field surrounding the house, dimly illuminated by the creeping dawn. The wind had died sometime in the night, leaving an unsettling stillness in its wake. Inside, Lauren sat awake in the kitchen, staring blankly at the steaming cup of coffee in her hands. The previous night's events replayed in her mind, Daniel's pale face, his trembling voice, and the chilling words that refused to leave her thoughts. Michael dismissed Daniel's words as a nightmare, but Lauren couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As she prepared breakfast, Daniel wandered into the kitchen, his eyes dull with sleep. "She was in my room again," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. Lauren nearly dropped the coffee mug. "Who, sweetheart?" "The lady," he said simply. "She was whispering. She said it's not safe." Lauren crouched beside him, trying to keep her voice steady. "Daniel, what did she look like?" Daniel frowned, as if struggling to remember. "She doesn't have a face." A chill crept down Lauren's spine. That evening, as Michael tucked Daniel into bed, Lauren double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. The house had begun to feel foreign, the shadows stretching just a little too far, the silence pressing down like a living thing. Hours later, Lauren woke abruptly. The house was utterly still, but something felt wrong. She glanced at the clock, 2:47 a.m. Slowly, she climbed out of bed and moved toward the hallway, drawn by an unfamiliar sound. A whisper, low, unintelligible, and seeping from Daniel's room. She pushed the door open, her breath shallow. The room was dark, but she could make out Daniel sitting up in bed, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something just beyond her range of hearing. "Daniel?" she called softly. He turned toward her slowly, his expression blank. Then he whispered something so faint she barely heard it. "She's inside the house now." From somewhere down the hall, a single floorboard creaked, long and slow, as though pressed beneath an unseen weight. Lauren's heart pounded as she turned toward the darkness. The night pressed heavily against the house, its silence broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. Lauren stood frozen in the hallway, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The floorboard had creaked again, closer this time. The darkness ahead of her seemed almost alive, shifting ever so slightly, as if something moved just beyond her sight. Lauren swallowed hard and stepped forward. "Michael?" she called in a whisper, though she knew deep down he was still asleep. No response. The hallway felt impossibly long as she made her way toward Daniel's room, her pulse hammering in her ears. She reached for the doorknob, but before she could turn it, a sound sent ice through her veins. A low, rasping breath, inches from her ear. She spun around, but there was nothing there, just shadows. Morning came slowly, but the unease lingered. Lauren told Michael about the noises, about Daniel's whispers, but he only offered a tired smile. "It's just a new house settling," he reasoned, "and Daniel's got an active imagination." But Daniel barely spoke that day. He sat in the living room, staring at the staircase, his small hands clutching his stuffed bear. By evening, Lauren found him tracing odd symbols onto a fogged-up window. "What are you drawing?" she asked. "She told me to do it," he murmured, "so she can find me." Lauren's blood ran cold. That night, Lauren kept the hallway light on. She lay awake, listening, waiting. Just past 3 a.m., a rhythmic tapping echoed from downstairs. It was slow, deliberate, almost thoughtful. She nudged Michael awake. "Do you hear that?" Groggy, he listened. Tap, tap, tap. He frowned. "Stay here, I'll check." Lauren watched as he pulled on his robe and disappeared into the hallway. The tapping stopped. Silence stretched unbearably long. Then a sharp, deafening bang rattled the entire house. Lauren jumped out of bed, her heart slamming against her ribs. She rushed to the landing, just as Michael staggered back up the stairs, his face drained of color. "Michael, what was it?" He didn't answer right away. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "The front door was wide open." Lauren grabbed Daniel and held him close. But as she did, she noticed something strange. His tiny hands were ice cold, and on his wrist, barely visible in the dim light, was a long, thin handprint that was not his own. The house seemed different in the early morning light, yet the unease from the night before still clung to Lauren's skin. She stood by the kitchen window, staring out at the vast countryside. The fields stretched endlessly, offering no sign of another soul for miles. But inside, she felt anything but alone. A faint sound pulled her from her thoughts. A whisper, low and indistinct, threading through the air like smoke. It came from the walls. Lauren pressed her ear against the plaster, straining to listen. The voice was muffled, but unmistakable, soft, feminine, and urgent. It was speaking words she couldn't quite understand, but the tone sent shivers down her spine. Daniel appeared at the kitchen doorway, watching her with sleepy eyes. "She's awake now," he said simply. Lauren turned sharply. "Who?" Daniel didn't answer. He just walked to the table and began eating his breakfast as if nothing had happened. Later that day, Lauren told Michael about the whispering, about Daniel's strange words, about the unease thickening in the house like fog. Michael sighed and rubbed his temples. "Lauren, we're exhausted. This is just stress. We've moved, we're adjusting, and Daniel's still a kid. He's gonna say strange things." "Then explain the symbols he drew," Lauren shot back, her voice tight. "Or the handprint on his wrist." Michael exhaled sharply. "There's got to be a logical explanation. We'll check the house. Maybe there's some old piping or vents causing the sounds." Lauren wasn't convinced. Something was wrong with the house, and she wasn't imagining it. That night, Lauren lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent, but her nerves were frayed. Just as she was about to drift off, a quiet giggle echoed through the hallway. A child's giggle. She bolted upright. She knew that sound. It was Daniel. But when she glanced at his bed, he was still there, fast asleep. A heavy weight settled in her chest. The giggle came again, this time from the doorway. Heart pounding, she turned toward the sound. A shadow lingered just beyond the threshold, tall and thin, its edges curling unnaturally, as if it were shifting against the dim light. Then it moved. Lauren couldn't scream. Her voice was trapped in her throat as the shadow slithered backward into the darkness, disappearing down the hall. and from Daniel's sleeping lips, a whisper escaped. "She's coming."
The night air was thick with silence. The house, once a refuge, now felt like a trap. Outside, the wind barely stirred the dry grass. Inside, Lauren sat upright in bed, clutching the sheets, her ears straining for any sound beyond the steady breathing of her sleeping husband. Then it came, soft and rhythmic, a lullaby sung in a voice too distant to place but too close to ignore. It drifted through the hallway like a cold breeze, carrying with it something deeply unsettling. Lauren rushed to Daniel's room, but he was still asleep. His lips parted slightly, breath slow and even. Yet the lullaby continued, growing fainter now, as if retreating deeper into the house. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the hallway light switch. The bulb flickered weakly before steadying. In the dim glow, she caught sight of something down the hall. The rocking chair in the guest room was moving. Back and forth, back and forth. Empty. Michael, still half asleep, brushed off Lauren's fear again, promising to check the house in the morning. But she couldn't sleep. Instead, she took a flashlight and crept downstairs. The air was colder here, stale, like an abandoned place. She hesitated at the doorway to the guest room, but something compelled her forward. On the floor, beneath the gently rocking chair, lay a small wooden cradle. It hadn't been there before. The wood was old, splintered at the edges, and carved into its surface were the same symbols Daniel had been drawing. Lauren's stomach clenched. She took a step closer, and the cradle rocked itself. At breakfast, Daniel picked at his food, his usual energy dulled. Lauren watched him carefully. "Daniel, did you hear anything last night?" He shook his head. "Do you know anything about the cradle in the guest room?" At that, his fork clattered against his plate. He looked up, his eyes dark and unreadable. "She used to have a baby, but it didn't stay." Lauren felt the blood drain from her face. "Who told you that?" Daniel didn't answer. He just looked toward the guest room, where the air suddenly felt heavier. That night, the lullaby returned, sweeter this time, as if calling to someone. And in the darkness, the cradle rocked once more. But this time, it wasn't empty. The night's stillness was shattered by a sudden, sharp creak. Lauren's eyes snapped open. The air in the bedroom felt dense, pressing against her chest like unseen hands. Michael slept soundly beside her, oblivious to the growing dread curling in the pit of her stomach. Then, from the hallway, came a whisper, faint yet unmistakable. "Come see." Lauren's body moved before her mind could protest. She stepped into the hallway, heart pounding. The floor beneath her feet felt colder than usual, as though the warmth of the house had been drained away. The guest room door stood ajar, swaying slightly as if someone had just passed through it. Inside, the rocking cradle sat motionless. The air smelled of dust and something faintly sweet, like decaying flowers. She reached for the light switch, but before her fingers could touch it, the chair beside the cradle rocked violently. Lauren gasped and stumbled backward. A breath of icy air brushed her neck. And then the whisper came again, closer this time. "Come see." The next morning, Lauren sat stiffly at the breakfast table, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Daniel hummed softly to himself as he stirred his cereal, the tune eerily similar to the lullaby from the night before. Lauren's voice was barely steady. "Daniel, where did you learn that song?" He didn't look up. "She sings it to me." Michael frowned. "Who does?" Daniel finally met his mother's eyes. "The lady in the room. She says you shouldn't be afraid." Lauren's stomach twisted. "Daniel, there's no one in that room." The boy tilted his head as if considering this. Then, in a voice softer than before, he murmured, "That's not what she told me." Determined to end this, Lauren searched the attic that afternoon. Dust floated through the dim light as she sifted through old boxes left by the previous owners. Finally, in a trunk tucked into the farthest corner, she found something wrapped in brittle cloth, a baby's dress, yellowed with age embroidered with a name nearly faded from existence: Eleanor. A chill ran down Lauren's spine as she turned it over and found dark, dried stains on the fabric. That night, as Lauren lay awake, the lullaby returned. Software coaxing. Closer. And from the guest room, the cradle began to rock on its own. Not empty, but waiting. The house stood in eerie silence. Outside, the wind barely stirred the trees, but inside, Lauren felt an unnatural stillness settling in. She sat in the dim glow of the living room lamp, staring at the baby's dress she had found. The name Eleanor was stitched with delicate precision, but the stains on the fabric sent ice through her veins. Then, a new sound, a soft shuffling from the hallway. She turned her head sharply. The shadows near the guest room moved. Lauren stood, gripping the dress in her trembling hands. The air around her thickened, as if something unseen was pressing against her. She stepped forward, heart hammering, until she was just outside the guest room door. It was open. Inside, the cradle rocked gently. Lauren's breath hitched. She had locked this door earlier. She was sure of it. A whisper coiled through the air, breathy and cold. "She's almost ready." The next morning, Lauren recounted the events to Michael, but his patience was wearing thin. "Lauren, this isn't healthy," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "You're not sleeping, you're seeing things, and now you're telling me that our house is haunted by a baby?" Lauren clenched her jaw. "I'm not making this up, Michael. Daniel knows things. He hums her lullaby. He talks to her. How do you explain that?" Michael exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Kids imagine things, Lauren. We've been under a lot of stress since moving here." But Lauren could see it in his eyes, the flicker of doubt, the smallest crack in his skepticism. Later that afternoon, Lauren sat with Daniel in the backyard, watching him dig absent-mindedly in the dirt. "Daniel," she said gently, "can you tell me more about the lady?" Daniel's small fingers stilled. He looked up, the sun casting odd shadows over his face. "She's waiting," he murmured. Lauren swallowed hard. "Waiting for what?" Daniel blinked slowly, as if the answer was obvious. "For her baby to come back." The wind picked up, rustling the trees with an unnatural wail. Daniel turned back to the dirt, humming the lullaby once more. Lauren's hands shook as she realized what he had been digging, a small, shallow grave. That night, the air inside the house grew heavy. The whispering returned, closer, more insistent, and from the hallway, a single shadow stood watching. The darkness inside the house felt different tonight, heavier, like a presence that had been waiting patiently was finally ready to reveal itself. Lauren lay in bed, her body tense, listening to the oppressive silence. Then came the unmistakable sound of wood creaking. Not the floorboards, not the windows, the cradle. It rocked slowly, back and forth, an eerie lull in the dead of night. Lauren forced herself up, each step toward the guest room feeling like wading through thick fog. The door was open again. Inside, the cradle rocked on its own. A sharp, shrill cry erupted from the cradle, piercing the still air. Lauren gasped, her hands flying to her ears. The sound was unnatural, a baby's wail, but warped, stretched, echoing with an unearthly resonance. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers trembling as they neared the cradle's edge. The moment she touched the wood, the crying stopped. Silence, thick, smothering. Then a whisper, so close it brushed against her ear. "She's here." Lauren barely slept. The next morning, she confronted Michael, exhaustion and desperation laced in her voice. "Michael, you heard that, didn't you? The crying, the whispers?" Michael rubbed his temples, avoiding her gaze. "Lauren, I don't know what's happening, but I think we need help. For you." Lauren recoiled. "You think I'm making this up? I didn't put that cradle there, Michael. And Daniel, he knows things." Michael sighed. "Maybe he's picking up on our stress. Maybe we're both imagining things because we're exhausted. But I need you to take a step back before this gets worse." Lauren stared at him, realization sinking in. He was never going to believe her. Later that day, Lauren found Daniel sitting cross-legged in the hallway, staring at the guest room door. Sweetheart, what are you doing? Daniel turned his head slowly, his small face eerily blank. She told me to wait. Lauren's breath hitched. Who did? The lady. She said her baby's almost back. Lauren knelt beside him, gripping his hands. Daniel, we have to leave, right now. But Daniel only smiled, tilting his head as though listening to something only he could hear. It's too late, Mommy. She's already inside. The cradle creaked once more, a rhythmic sound that sent ice through Lauren's veins. Then from inside the guest room, a newborn's gurgle echoed softly. The air in the house had thickened, heavy with something unseen yet unmistakably present. Lauren gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, staring at the guest room door. It had remained shut all morning, yet the creaking of the cradle inside never ceased. Then, as if sensing her thoughts, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the cradle rocked slowly, but this time, a shadow sat within it. Lauren backed away, her breath caught in her throat. The shadow twisted, its outline shifting like smoke, yet unmistakably forming the small, delicate figure of an infant. But no eyes, no mouth, just darkness where a baby's face should be. A soft, eerie giggle filled the room. She slammed the door shut, her hands trembling. She could still hear the cradle moving, the quiet giggling beneath the floorboards. Michael found her moments later, pale and shaking. Lauren, what's wrong? She could barely whisper. Something's in there. Michael exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. Lauren, you're scaring Daniel. There is nothing in that room. She looked at him, desperate. Then why is the cradle rocking, Michael? He hesitated. That evening, as they sat for dinner, Daniel pushed his peas around his plate, unusually quiet. Lauren reached out. Daniel, sweetheart, talk to me. What's going on? He glanced up, his expression unreadable. She's almost done waiting. Lauren's stomach twisted. Waiting for what? Daniel blinked slowly. For the baby to wake up. The room felt colder. Lauren's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. Lauren couldn't sleep. The whispering had returned, snaking through the walls like a soft breath against her skin. The cradle creaked every few minutes, stopping only when she strained to listen. At 3 a.m., she finally got up. She had to see, had to know. She pushed the guest room door open, holding her breath. The cradle sat still. Relief flooded her, until she noticed the empty baby's dress draped over the side. Then, the fabric twitched. A low, cooing sound filled the air, like an infant stirring from slumber. Lauren took a step back, but the floor behind her creaked. Something was standing right behind her. Lauren turned, but before she could scream, the room plunged into darkness. From the cradle, the shadow began to rise. Darkness swallowed the room as a sharp, chilling silence fell over the house. Lauren's breath hitched, her pulse pounding in her ears. The shadow rising from the cradle stretched unnaturally, its form expanding like smoke curling against the ceiling. Then, a whisper. You waited too long. A sudden force slammed the door behind her. She was trapped. An unseen terror. Lauren stumbled back, her body trembling. The air grew thick with an unbearable cold, biting into her skin. From the cradle came the sound of shifting fabric, as if something was stirring beneath the empty baby's dress. Then a cry, sharp, piercing, but wrong. It wasn't a baby's wail. It was something else, something ancient. Lauren pressed herself against the door, fumbling for the knob, but it refused to turn. The whispering swelled, overlapping voices murmuring in a language she couldn't understand. And in the cradle, something began to crawl out. Michael woke with a start, jolted by an unseen force. The air in the bedroom felt like ice. He turned to wake Lauren, but her side of the bed was empty. A loud thud echoed from the hallway. Lauren! Michael rushed out of bed, his heart racing. As he stepped into the corridor, a shadow darted across the wall, something small, crawling toward Daniel's room. Michael's breath caught in his throat. The guest room door stood slightly ajar, a faint glow flickering inside. Then, a voice. "Michael!" Lauren gasped from behind the door. "It's waking up." Daniel sat up in bed, eyes wide and blank. He wasn't asleep, but he wasn't awake either. His lips moved soundlessly, as if speaking to someone unseen. Lauren clutched her son's shoulders. "Daniel, wake up!" His eyes finally focused. He stared at her for a long moment before whispering, "Mommy, it's hungry." Lauren shuddered. "What is?" Daniel's gaze flickered to the doorway, where the shadow now loomed, its body twisting unnaturally. The baby. A sudden pressure wrapped around Lauren's wrist, cold, small fingers gripping tight. She looked down. A hand, not Daniel's, clung to her in the darkness, and from the cradle the crying turned into laughter. The laughter from the cradle filled the room, echoing in distorted waves. Lauren's breath came in short gasps as she stared at the small, ice-cold fingers wrapped around her wrist. The grip was too tight, unnatural, as if whatever held her had no intention of letting go. She forced herself to look down. The tiny hand belonged to something not human. Dark, shriveled skin stretched over frail bones, its nails jagged and cracked. As she tried to pull away, the fingers tightened, pulling her closer. Then, the laughter stopped. A whisper slithered into her ear. "Feed me!" Michael burst through the door just in time to see Lauren yanked forward. He lunged, grabbing her shoulders, pulling with all his strength, but an unseen force dragged her toward the cradle. "Michael!" Lauren screamed, clawing at his arms. "Get Daniel out of here!" Michael gritted his teeth, refusing to let go. The room grew darker, the air thick with a nauseating rot. From the cradle, the shadow expanded, forming the twisted outline of a child. Then Daniel spoke. "It's hungry, Daddy. If you don't feed it, it'll take Mommy." Michael froze, his grip tightening on Lauren. "What are you talking about? Feed it what?" Daniel's small face remained eerily calm. "She's been waiting. If she doesn't get her baby back, she'll take someone else." Lauren shook her head violently. "No, no, Daniel, we are not giving it anything." Daniel's eyes flickered toward the cradle, as if listening to something Michael and Lauren couldn't hear. Then he whispered, "She says she wants me." Lauren's scream shattered the room. Michael scooped Daniel into his arms, stepping back toward the hallway. "We're leaving. Now." The door slammed shut. Lauren turned, horror sinking into her bones as the dark figure from the cradle crawled onto the floor. It twisted unnaturally, its hollow eyes fixed on Daniel. "No," Lauren snarled, stepping in front of her son. "You can't have him." The thing let out a low, guttural growl. Then the whisper came again, curling around them like smoke. "Choose. One stays, one leaves." The room plunged into utter darkness. Lauren felt cold fingers brush against her throat. Michael clutched Daniel tightly, his heart hammering in his chest. And then came the voice, closer this time, almost amused. "Time's running out." The darkness pressed against them, suffocating. Lauren's pulse pounded in her ears as the whispering voice circled them, its presence thick in the air. Cold fingers skimmed across her throat, sending a jolt of terror through her spine. "Choose!" the voice hissed again, impatient now. "One stays. One leaves." Michael tightened his grip on Daniel, his breath ragged. "No one is staying," he growled. "We're all leaving." The air around them shuddered. Then, the laughter returned. The cradle began rocking violently, unseen hands slamming it against the wooden floor. A sharp, inhuman wail filled the room, rattling the walls. Lauren grabbed Michael's arm. "We can't fight it. We have to outsmart it." Michael's eyes darted to Daniel, who stood perfectly still, his small hand stretched toward the cradle as if listening. "Daniel, honey," Lauren whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "What is it saying?" Daniel blinked. "She says we have something that belongs to her." Lauren's mind raced. Something that belonged to her. The baby's dress, the cradle, the whispers about waiting. Then it hit her. "The dress," she gasped, turning to Michael. "The one I found in the attic. It's hers." Michael didn't hesitate. He bolted for the attic, his footsteps thundering through the house. The whispering grew frantic, the entity sensing their realization. Lauren held Daniel close, shielding him as the temperature plummeted. The walls trembled, the cradle flipping onto its side with a deafening crack. Then the shadows lunged. Michael returned, clutching the yellowed baby's dress in his hands. The second he stepped into the room, the shadows froze. Lauren reached for the dress. With a deep breath, she held it out. "This is yours, isn't it?" The air stilled. A small, fragile hand, dark and withered, reached out from the cradle, touching the fabric. A sound, almost like a sigh, echoed through the room. Then the laughter ceased. The shadows began retreating, curling into themselves. The oppressive weight lifted, leaving behind only the sound of Lauren's ragged breaths. Daniel looked up, his voice small. "She's going now." The cradle stopped moving, but before the last shadow disappeared, the whisper came one final time, soft and almost grateful. For now. The silence in the house was deafening. The oppressive darkness had lifted, but Lauren could still feel it lingering, like a weight pressing against her chest. She stood in the nursery, staring at the cradle, now completely still. "It's over," Michael whispered beside her. Lauren wasn't so sure. Then, from deep within the house, a floorboard creaked. Lauren's fingers tightened around the fabric of her shirt as she turned towards the hallway. The attic door, left open from Michael's frantic search for the dress, was still ajar. A faint draft slithered down from above, carrying a scent she couldn't place. Musty, like old paper and something faintly sweet. Daniel, clutching her hand, whispered, "She's still watching." Lauren exchanged a look with Michael. "We need to be sure," she said. Michael hesitated but nodded. "We check the attic, now." The wooden steps groaned beneath their weight as they climbed into the attic. Dust floated through the dim light cast by a single dangling bulb. The trunks, the forgotten furniture, the cobwebbed relics of another family's life, all untouched. Lauren's eyes scanned the room, her heartbeat steady but sharp. Then she saw it. A small wooden box nestled in the farthest corner of the attic. The lid was slightly open. Michael reached for it first, hesitating only a second before lifting the lid fully. Inside, wrapped in layers of faded lace, was a lock of dark, brittle hair. Next to it, an old, yellowed letter. Lauren unfolded the fragile paper, her breath hitching as she read. "She cries for her child. She waits, and when she is forgotten, she will return to take another." A loud bang from below sent Lauren stumbling back. Daniel yelped, clutching his father's leg. The house was not empty. From the nursery, the cradle began rocking again. Soft at first, then harder, more erratic. A single whisper curled through the attic, wrapping around them like cold fingers. "You never asked. What happened to the first child?" Lauren's blood ran cold. The letter slipped from her fingers as another voice, small and trembling, joined the first. A child's voice. "Help me!" Michael lunged for the attic door, yanking it shut behind them, but the whispering continued to rise. From below, the cradle slammed against the floor. The entity was not gone. Lauren's breath caught in her throat. The figure's hollow eyes bore into her, filled with something beyond rage, desperation. "Give her back." The voice cracked like splintering wood, raw with grief and longing. The skeletal remains in the cradle twitched, the tiny bones rattling as if trying to move. The air in the nursery turned unbearably cold, a heavy weight pressing down on Lauren's chest. Michael grabbed her hand. "We need to go, now." Lauren couldn't move. Daniel took a step forward, his voice small. "She's sad. She lost her baby." Michael yanked Daniel back. "We're leaving!" The figure trembled, its form flickering, distorting like a tattered veil caught in the wind. The sobbing grew louder, shaking the walls, making the cradle rock violently. Lauren clutched the edge of the crib. "We need to bury the baby," she whispered. "She won't stop until we do." Michael's face paled. "You can't be serious." Lauren turned to Daniel. Where should she rest? Daniel hesitated, then pointed toward the backyard. She showed me. Under the big tree. That's where she was before. A sudden howl of wind swept through the nursery, sending the skeletal remains rolling from the cradle onto the wooden floor. Michael didn't argue anymore. He scooped up the brittle bones carefully in the lace, wrapping them as gently as possible. The moment he did, the room lurched, the floorboards groaning as if the house itself was angry. Lauren grabbed Daniel's hand and bolted for the door. The lights in the hallway flickered violently. The shadows followed. They burst through the back door into the frigid night. The tree loomed ahead, its branches swaying despite the still air. Michael dropped to his knees and began digging with his bare hands. The whispering rose behind them, furious and pleading all at once. Give her back! Give her back! Daniel knelt beside Michael, scooping dirt as fast as he could. Hurry! She's coming! The hole was deep enough. Lauren gently placed the bundle inside, her fingers trembling. The wind stopped. A final anguished wail shook the ground beneath them. Then, silence. Michael exhaled sharply. Is it over? Daniel stared at the tree, his voice barely a whisper. I don't think she's gone. The night was unnervingly still. The fresh mound of earth beneath the tree seemed undisturbed, yet Lauren couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. Daniel stood beside her, his small fingers curled into her sleeve. She's still here, he whispered. Michael let out a sharp breath. Daniel, it's over. We buried her. She's at peace now. But Daniel didn't move. His wide eyes stayed locked on the tree, listening. And then, the whispering returned. Lauren's fingers clenched into fists. The voice was faint, almost carried away by the wind, but unmistakable. Not enough! Michael grabbed her arm. We're going inside. Now! As they turned toward the house, the porch light flickered. The windows trembled in their frames. A low creak echoed through the yard, like a branch bending under something heavy. Lauren turned back. The tree was bleeding. Thick black sap seeped from the bark, pooling at the roots. Daniel knelt down, tracing a finger through it. She's still sad, he murmured. She's still waiting. Lauren's stomach twisted. For what? Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. For her child, Michael swore under his breath. We buried her. What more does she want? A sudden gust of wind howled through the yard, rattling the windows. The front door slammed open. The house was beckoning them inside. Inside, the house was silent. Too silent. Lauren stepped forward cautiously. The air smelled different. Damp, old, decayed. A single sound broke the stillness. The cradle was rocking again. Lauren sucked in a breath. The nursery door was ajar, shadows curling at its edges. Something waited beyond. Michael stepped beside her. This ends now. Together they pushed open the door. Inside, the cradle rocked violently, unseen hands slamming it against the floor, and standing beside it, the figure of the mother. Her head lifted slowly, her hollow eyes locking onto Lauren. Give her back. The whispering swirled around them, growing louder, pressing into their ears. Daniel stepped forward, his small hand outstretched. Mommy, he said softly, I think I know what she wants. The air in the nursery thickened, heavy with something unseen yet suffocating. The figure of the mother remained motionless, her hollow eyes locked onto Lauren, the whispered demand still echoing through the room. Give her back. Daniel took another step forward, his small hand outstretched toward the shadowed form. She doesn't want to hurt us, he said softly. She just wants what was taken. Michael yanked Daniel back. Daniel, no! The cradle suddenly lurched forward, slamming into the floor with a deafening crash. Lauren swallowed hard, her pulse roaring in her ears. Who took your baby? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The shadows in the nursery shivered, curling around the figure like smoke. Then, slowly, a single word formed on the wall, scrawled in deep, jagged scratches. Lies. A chill rippled down Lauren's spine. What lies? What happened to your child? The mother let out a slow, agonized breath. The cradle began to rock again, this time more gently, as if someone was placing an invisible child inside. Daniel tilted his head, listening to something only he could hear. She says, she was tricked. They never let her baby rest. Lauren turned to Michael, her voice shaking. We didn't bury the right remains. Outside, the wind howled as if the very earth was protesting. The tree where they had buried the bones groaned, its roots pushing through the fresh soil. Michael grabbed a shovel. If we didn't bury the right child, then where? A loud knock rattled the front door. Lauren froze. Slowly, she turned toward the sound. Daniel spoke first. She says, "It's here." The front door creaked open on its own. A small, skeletal handprints appeared on the wooden floor, leading inside. The whispering swelled, urgent and insistent. Find her. The skeletal handprints on the wooden floor grew darker, as if the unseen child was pressing harder with each step. The whispering grew more frantic, swirling around them in unseen currents. Lauren's chest tightened. She wants us to follow. Michael clenched his jaw. Or she's leading us into a trap. Daniel, standing between them, simply nodded. We have to find her. The family moved cautiously, following the tiny handprints as they led deeper into the house. The air turned colder, thick with the scent of damp earth and something decayed. The prints stopped abruptly in front of the basement door. Lauren's stomach dropped. We never checked down there. Michael hesitated before gripping the handle. The door swung open on its own, revealing a yawning darkness below. Descending the stairs, each step groaned beneath their weight. The basement smelled of mildew and neglect, but there was something else, something hidden. Daniel walked ahead, unafraid. He stopped in the center of the room and pointed at the dirt floor. She's here. Michael grabbed a rusted shovel leaning against the wall and plunged it into the ground. The soil was too loose. Lauren's breath hitched. Someone dug here before. After several frantic digs, Michael's shovel struck something solid, a small wooden box. Michael lifted the box, its hinges rusted shut. With a sharp yank, the lid gave way, releasing a wave of stale, suffocating air. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, was another set of tiny bones. Lauren's hands flew to her mouth. Oh my God! Daniel stared at the remains. This is her real baby. A sudden gust of wind howled through the basement, knocking over shelves and scattering dust into the air. The whispering turned to sobs. The walls shook as the ghostly presence surged around them. The figure of the grieving mother materialized at the edge of the basement, her skeletal fingers outstretched, her form shifting between solid and shadow. Michael shielded Lauren and Daniel as the entity let out a wail that made their ears ring. Daniel, voice firm but calm, stepped forward. "You found her. You can take her now." The spirit hesitated, its form flickering. The sobbing softened, the whispering fading into the stillness. Then the shadow began to dissolve. The ghost's form disintegrated, her sorrow dissipating with the wind. The tiny bones in the box shuddered, then settled, at peace at last. For the first time in days, the house was silent. Lauren exhaled, clutching Daniel tightly. But Daniel's eyes remained locked on the darkness beyond the basement stairs. She's gone, but something else is still here. The basement felt different now, emptier, but not in a comforting way. The air was thick, oppressive, as if something unseen had curled itself into the corners of the room. Lauren watched Daniel, his small frame rigid, his gaze never leaving the blackened space beyond the stairs. "Daniel," she whispered, "what do you see?" He didn't answer. He just pointed. And then, the shadows moved. Michael tensed, stepping in front of his family. "We did what she wanted. It should be over." But the air grew colder. The whispering returned, not sorrowful this time, but hungry. Daniel's voice was barely audible. "It's not her anymore." Lauren's stomach twisted. "Then what is it?" A sudden knock rattled the basement door upstairs, slow, methodical, Knock, knock, knock. Michael exhaled sharply. We're not alone. The knock came again, heavier this time. The walls groaned as if something was pressing against them, testing their strength. Daniel turned his wide eyes toward his mother. It wants to come inside. Lauren shook her head. Number, we're not opening that door. Michael grabbed a hammer from a nearby shelf, his knuckles white. We need to get upstairs, now. The moment he said it, the basement lights flickered violently. And then, the door upstairs creaked open on its own. Racing up the stairs, they burst into the hallway just in time to see the front door swinging open. Beyond it, the night was impossibly black, deeper than the absence of light, a void. Lauren grabbed Daniel, pressing him close. Michael, shut the door! Michael pushed forward, slamming it shut with all his strength. But as soon as it clicked, a voice, low, guttural, and inhuman, whispered from the other side. Let me in. The air grew heavier, pressing against their chests. The house groaned as if shifting under an invisible weight. Daniel shuddered. Mommy, it's inside already. Lauren turned sharply, eyes darting to the hallway. The darkness was breathing. Lauren's breath caught in her throat. The hallway before her was no longer just dark. It was alive. The shadows pulsed, stretching along the walls like fingers reaching for them. Michael gripped the hammer tightly. Daniel, stay close. But Daniel didn't move. His small body was tense, his gaze locked onto the writhing darkness. It's not outside anymore, he whispered. It never was. And then, the whispering began again. Lauren grabbed Daniel's hand and took a shaky step back. The house trembled under a weightless pressure, the walls creaking as if something unseen was pressing through. A shape shifted in the shadows, tall, twisted, watching. Michael clenched his jaw. What do you want? He demanded, his voice barely steady. Pause. Then, home, the voice rasped. This is our home. The front door rattled violently, as if something outside was trying to force its way in. Lauren turned to Michael, her voice desperate. We can't stay here. Michael nodded, grabbing Daniel's arm. We run on 3. 1, the hallway lights flashed violently. 2, a chilling breath ghosted over Lauren's neck, sending shivers down her spine. 3, they bolted, but as they reached the door, it swung open on its own. Beyond the threshold, the night stretched into nothingness. A vast, endless void. Lauren skidded to a stop, nearly losing her balance. Michael, where's the street? The yard? Michael grabbed her, his breath ragged. It's gone. Everything is gone. Daniel clung to Lauren's leg. We never left, he murmured. The shadows behind them lurched forward, swallowing the last of the light. And in the darkness, a single whisper remained. You belong to us now. The front door slammed shut, trapping them inside the abyss. Daniel's small fingers curled into Lauren's. Mommy, I think it's waking up. The house trembled as the void consumed everything outside. Lauren gripped Daniel's hand tightly, her pulse roaring in her ears. Michael stepped in front of them, hammer still in his grip, though it felt useless against whatever had trapped them. The whispering swelled, crawling into their minds. You are home now. Then, the walls began to bleed. A deep, guttural groan rattled the floor beneath their feet. Cracks slithered up the walls, dark liquid oozing from them. The air grew thick, suffocating, carrying the scent of decay. Michael grabbed Lauren's arm. We have to move. Lauren pulled Daniel closer. Move where? There's nowhere to go. A sharp laughter echoed from the shadows, mocking them. You never left, the voice hissed. You never will. Daniel suddenly tugged at Lauren's sleeve, his voice eerily calm. Mommy, it's waking up. Lauren shuddered. What is? He pointed toward the ceiling, where the cracks had formed a jagged, gaping mouth. The darkness inside it pulsed, shifting, breathing. The house, Daniel whispered. It's alive. A sudden jolt sent them sprawling as the floor bucked beneath them, as if something was stirring underneath. Michael coughed, struggling to stand. "We need to find a way out. Now!" They ran, dodging as pieces of the ceiling collapsed around them. The hallways stretched unnaturally, bending and shifting, leading them in circles. Every door they reached slammed shut before they could grasp the handle. The house was toying with them. Then Daniel stopped, his small hands clenched into fists. "Mommy, we have to stop running. It won't let us leave." Lauren turned, gasping for air. "Then what do we do?" Daniel's eyes darkened. "We have to wake it up first." The whispering turned to low, guttural breathing, rumbling from deep within the walls. Michael swallowed hard. "And how do we do that?" Daniel took a step forward, pressing his palm against the bleeding wall. His voice was barely above a whisper. "We call its name." Lauren's breath hitched. "And what name is that?" Daniel turned his head slowly, eyes wide with something between terror and knowing. "It's been whispering it to me this whole time." The house shuddered violently. Then Daniel spoke the name. The moment Daniel spoke the name, the air split open like a wound. The walls trembled, the bleeding cracks widening into gaping voids of darkness. A deep, guttural screech erupted from the foundation, vibrating through their bones. Lauren staggered backward, gripping Michael's arm. "What did you say?" Daniel's expression was unreadable. "I don't know, but it heard me." Then, the house lurched, as if something deep beneath it had awakened. The ceiling rippled, stretching downward like melting wax. The jagged mouth from before twisted, forming into something almost human, its voice layered with countless whispers. "You called me back. Now you will stay." Michael swung the hammer at the closest wall, but the impact did nothing. The house was no longer wood and plaster, but something alive. Lauren's voice shook. "We don't belong to you." The entity laughed, low and amused. "You have always belonged to me." Daniel looked up at his parents. "It's angry because it was forgotten. That's why it won't let anyone leave." Michael gritted his teeth. "Then how do we make it forget us?" Daniel hesitated. "We have to give it something else to remember." Lauren's breath caught. "Like what?" Daniel turned toward the shifting walls. "A new name, a new story. We have to erase what it was." The entity roared, shadows slamming into the family like a tidal wave. Lauren grabbed Daniel's shoulders, eyes desperate. "Then do it!" Daniel closed his eyes and spoke again, his voice clear and unwavering. "Your name is nothing. Your story is over. You are forgotten." The entity screamed. The walls convulsed, the void splintering apart. The shadows twisted in agony, unraveling as Daniel's words tore through them. Michael grabbed Lauren and Daniel, pulling them toward the front door. The floor cracked apart, the house groaning like a dying beast. And then, light. A brilliant, blinding light. When Lauren opened her eyes, they were outside. The house behind them was gone. Only an empty field remained, silent beneath the pale morning sun. Michael exhaled sharply. "Did we?" Daniel turned to his mother, his voice barely a whisper. "It let us go, but it's not really gone." Lauren's blood ran cold. "Then where is it?" Daniel's eyes darkened. "Waiting." The sun cast long shadows across the empty field where the house once stood. The air was eerily still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Lauren stood frozen, her fingers gripping Daniel's shoulders. "It's over," Michael whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Daniel shook his head. "Number. It's just somewhere else now." A gust of wind stirred the grass, carrying with it a faint whisper. "Come back." That night, they checked into a motel miles away. Michael paced the room while Lauren sat stiffly on the bed. Daniel curled beside her. She could still feel the house's presence, like a weight pressing down on her chest. Michael ran a hand through his hair. "We should leave town. Just go." Daniel spoke softly. "It won't matter." Lauren turned to him. "What do you mean?" Daniel hesitated. "It knows us now. It can follow." The motel lights flickered. A chill crawled up Lauren's spine. "Michael!" Then, 3 slow knocks on the motel door. Michael grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, before inching toward the door. His breath was shallow, his fingers trembling as he reached for the handle. Lauren pulled Daniel close, heart hammering. Knock, knock, knock. Michael swung the door open. Nothing, just the dark, empty parking lot beyond. Then Daniel whispered, "It's inside." A shadow moved in the bathroom mirror. Lauren lunged for the light switch, but the room plunged into darkness. The whispering returned, swirling around them, growing louder, more insistent. "You can't run. You are home." The shadows twisted, stretching toward them. Daniel's small hand gripped Lauren's arm. "Mommy," he murmured. "We let it in." Michael grabbed both of them, pulling them toward the door, but it slammed shut on its own. The air turned ice cold. The shadows coiled tighter, forming the shape of a house, a home they thought they had escaped. Daniel turned, his face pale. It never needed the house. Lauren's breath hitched. Then what does it need? Daniel looked up at her, eyes dark and distant. Us. The darkness inside the motel room thickened, pressing against them like an unseen force. Lauren gripped Daniel's arm, her pulse hammering. Michael's knuckles turned white around the lamp he still held, as if it could protect them from whatever lurked in the shadows. "We have to get out of here," Michael said, his voice tight. Lauren swallowed hard. "Daniel, can it follow us anywhere?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "It doesn't need a place anymore. It just needs us." A low hum vibrated through the air, filling the room with an unnatural energy. The shadows in the bathroom mirror began to move. Michael lunged for the motel door, yanking it open. Beyond it, more darkness. Not the night sky, not the parking lot. Just a vast, endless void stretching into oblivion. Lauren's breath caught in her throat. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The whispering grew louder, curling into her ears. "Home. Stay. Home." Daniel tugged her hand. "Mommy, we have to close our eyes." Michael shook his head. "Daniel, we don't have time for—" "Close them," Daniel insisted. "It only exists if we see it." Lauren shut her eyes, heart pounding. Michael hesitated before doing the same. The air around them shifted, the heavy pressure growing unbearable. The whispering faltered. Then, a deep, inhuman screech tore through the silence. The room shook violently, the furniture crashing to the floor. The shadows lashed out, but without their gaze, they seemed weaker, unraveling at the edges. Lauren clenched her fists. "Daniel, tell us when to open them." Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. "Not yet." The whispering turned to shrieks, the pressure peaked, and then silence. "Now," Daniel whispered. Lauren opened her eyes. The motel room was normal again. The door led outside. The lights were steady. The mirror was just a mirror. Michael exhaled sharply, his grip on the lamp loosening. "Did we?" Daniel looked around, his face pale. "It's still watching, but we're not trapped. Not yet." Lauren's stomach twisted. "Then what do we do?" Daniel's small voice trembled. "We can't let it find a way back in." The morning sun cast a pale light over the motel parking lot. Lauren, Michael, and Daniel sat in the car, unmoving. The weight of the night still pressed on them, though the shadows had retreated. "We can't stay here," Michael said, gripping the steering wheel. "We have to keep moving." Daniel, staring out the window, whispered, "It's waiting for us to make a mistake." Lauren turned sharply. "Daniel, what do you mean?" He exhaled slowly. "It's looking for a way back in. It just needs one of us to let it." They drove for hours, passing town after town, but no matter how far they went, the feeling never left. Every now and then, the radio crackled, a whisper bleeding through the static. Michael turned it off. "We'll find somewhere safe." Daniel shook his head. "There's no safe place. It's attached to us now." Lauren swallowed hard. "Then what do we do?" Daniel hesitated before answering, his voice quiet. "We have to choose." That night, they stopped at another motel. The air was heavy, still charged with unseen energy. Lauren woke to find Daniel standing by the window, staring at his own reflection in the glass. "Daniel?" He turned, his eyes darker than before. It's talking to me. It wants to make a deal. Michael sat up, alarmed. What kind of deal? Daniel's lips trembled. One of us stays. The others go free. Lauren's stomach twisted. Number absolutely not. A knock echoed through the motel room. Slow, rhythmic, waiting. The air in the room turned ice cold. The shadows stretched long, pooling at the door. Don't answer it, Michael whispered. But Daniel took a step forward. I know what it wants. Lauren reached for him. Daniel, please. He turned back, eyes sad but resolute. I can send it away, but I have to go with it. Michael grabbed him. No, there has to be another way. Daniel's small fingers pressed against Michael's chest. You'll forget me. That's how it works. If I go, it erases me from your life. It won't hurt you anymore. Tears blurred Lauren's vision. No, baby, we can fight this. The knocking grew louder, insistent. Daniel smiled softly. You won't even remember me after this, but I'll always remember you. The door swung open. The next morning, Michael and Lauren drove down an endless highway, a strange emptiness in their chests. They couldn't remember why they felt like they had lost something, someone. But somewhere, in the places between worlds, a child's voice whispered, I kept you safe. And then, silence.